The last thing James Calloway expected that night was to kiss a complete stranger. But there he was, standing in the dimly lit back hallway of the Sapphire Room, the city's most exclusive rooftop lounge, with his lips pressed against the softest mouth he'd ever felt. The woman in his arms gasped, pushing against his chest, her wide, startled eyes locking onto his. "What the hell?" she breathed. James blinked, his head spinning not just from the whiskey, but from the sensation that had jolted through him the moment their lips met. He hadn't meant to grab her. He hadn't meant to kiss anyone at all, but in his drunken haze, he'd mistaken her for someone else. And now, as the realization sank in, he saw her more clearly. She wasn't some socialite or one of the women who threw themselves at him during these high-end events. She was a waitress he had just kissed. Her uniform, a crisp white shirt and black vest, was slightly wrinkled from where he'd pulled her close. A tray lay on the ground beside them, the glasses shattered, the spilled champagne pooling around their feet. James ran a hand through his dark hair, trying to gather the right words. "I thought you were someone else," she huffed, crossing her arms. "Well, I'm not." He should have just walked away, apologized and left it at that, but something about her made it impossible to move. Maybe it was the way her chest rose and fell, like she was just as shaken as he was. Maybe it was the way her lips were still parted, as if she couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Or maybe it was the fact that, despite the chaos in his life, he hadn't felt anything this real in years. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the moment. "Is everything all right here?" A manager asked, looking between them. The waitress straightened, her expression hardening. "Yes, sir, just an accident." The manager's eyes flicked to James, recognizing him instantly. "Mr. Calloway, I apologize for any inconvenience." James held up a hand. "It was my mistake." Then, turning to the waitress, he hesitated. "What's your name?" She looked at him warily. "Lena." "Lena," he repeated, letting the name settle on his tongue. It felt right somehow. She didn't give him another second before grabbing her tray and brushing past him, disappearing back into the crowded lounge. James should have let it go. It was a drunken mistake, a fluke. But as he watched her walk away, something inside him whispered that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, James sat in his corner office, staring out at the city skyline. He had a million things to do: meetings, contracts, deals that needed closing. But all he could think about was that kiss, her lips, the way she'd looked at him. He wasn't the type of man to be distracted. He was a self-made millionaire, the owner of one of the largest real estate firms in the country. He didn't have time for whatever this was. But that didn't stop him from finding out who Lena was. "Sir, I have the information you requested," his assistant, Marcus, said, stepping into the office. James leaned forward. "Go on." "Her full name is Lena Carter, 25 years old. No criminal record. She's been working at the Sapphire Room for the past 2 years, lives in a small apartment in Brooklyn. No serious relationships that we could find." James frowned. "Why does that last part sound like you're investigating a business competitor?" Marcus smirked. "Because you asked me to look into her like she was one." James exhaled, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't sure why he'd wanted to know more about her. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was because, deep down, he knew that kiss had meant something. And he had every intention of finding out what. Lena had spent the entire night trying to erase the memory of that kiss. But no matter how hard she tried, the feeling lingered, the warmth of his hands. The way he had looked at her afterward, like he was just as confused as she was. It was ridiculous. James Calloway was one of the richest men in the city. He was untouchable, and she was just a waitress trying to make ends meet. She had no business thinking about him. So, when her manager called her into his office that afternoon, she expected it to be about the broken glasses. Maybe even a warning. What she didn't expect was for James Calloway to be sitting in the chair across from her. Her stomach dropped. "Lena," the manager said, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Mr. Calloway has requested to speak with you. Lena clenched her fists. About what? James met her gaze, his expression unreadable. I'd prefer to speak in private. Her manager nodded. Take your time. The moment the door closed, Lena folded her arms. What do you want? James studied her for a long second before answering. Dinner, she blinked. Excuse me. I want to take you to dinner. She let out a sharp laugh. You're joking, right? I don't joke. Why would you want to take me to dinner? James leaned forward, his voice quieter now. Because I haven't stopped thinking about last night, and something tells me you haven't either. Her breath caught. She wanted to deny it, wanted to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was he wasn't, and that terrified her. I don't date millionaires, she said finally. James smirked. Then consider this a business meeting. Lena shook her head. I don't do business with millionaires either. He exhaled, running a hand down his jaw. Just one dinner, Lena. If you hate it, I'll leave you alone. She should have said no. Should have walked out of that office and never looked back. But something told her that James Calloway wasn't the kind of man you walked away from, and deep down, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Lena sat across from James in a dimly lit restaurant that screamed luxury. The kind of place with chandeliers dripping from the ceiling and waiters who moved like shadows, anticipating needs before they were spoken. She had no idea how she had let herself end up here, but there she was, feeling the weight of his gaze as she stared at the untouched plate of food in front of her. This is insane, she murmured, finally looking up at him. James tilted his head slightly, a slow smirk playing at his lips. Is it? You don't know me, she pointed out, and I don't know you. You're a millionaire and I'm a woman who intrigues me, he cut in smoothly. She exhaled, gripping the edge of the table. Why? James leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Because I don't make mistakes, Lena. And yet that night, his voice dropped slightly, sending a shiver down her spine. I kissed you. A mistake, maybe, but it didn't feel like one. Lena's breath hitched. She hated how effortlessly he could dismantle her defenses. It was infuriating. That's just attraction, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. It doesn't mean anything. James studied her, his expression unreadable. Doesn't it? Lena clenched her fists under the table. She wasn't someone who got swept up in fantasy. Her life was grounded in reality, bills, work, survival. Whatever this was, it wasn't real. You don't do this, she said suddenly. James raised an eyebrow. Do what? Pursue people like me. He let out a low chuckle. People like you. You know exactly what I mean, she shot back. You date models, heiresses, women who belong in places like this. I'm not one of them. James tapped a finger against his glass, considering her words. Maybe that's the point. Lena's stomach twisted. She needed to end this before she got pulled into something she couldn't control. This isn't going to work, she said firmly. James didn't even blink. Why? Because we're from different worlds. A slow smile curved his lips. Then let me show you mine. Lena opened her mouth to protest, but he had already pulled out his phone, murmuring something to whoever was on the other end. Minutes later, they were stepping out of the restaurant, and Lena barely had time to process what was happening before a sleek black car pulled up beside them. She hesitated. James, trust me, he said simply, and against all logic, she did. The ride was silent, tension thick between them. Lena watched the city blur past, her mind racing. She had no idea where he was taking her, but the anticipation curled in her stomach, equal parts excitement and unease. When the car finally stopped, she inhaled sharply. A rooftop. But not just any rooftop. This one overlooked the entire skyline, the city glittering beneath them like a sea of stars. James stepped out first, turning to offer his hand. She hesitated, then took it. As they walked toward the edge, the wind whispered around them, cool against her skin. Why are we here? She asked softly. James exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Because I wanted you to see what I see. Lena frowned. And what exactly do you see? He turned to face her fully, his expression serious now. A life that's always been controlled, expectations, deals, people who want something from me. He paused. But you don't want anything. Lena swallowed hard. That doesn't mean anything. James studied her, his eyes dark and unreadable. It means everything. Her pulse pounded. She needed to break whatever spell this was before she lost herself in it completely. You're impossible, she muttered. James smirked. So I've been told. Lena exhaled sharply, shaking her head. This still doesn't make sense. Not everything has to, he said quietly. Lena turned away, gripping the railing. She couldn't do this. She couldn't fall into something that had no future. I should go, she said finally. James was silent for a moment before he nodded. I'll take you home. The ride back was different. Still silent, but heavier now. When they reached her apartment, Lena hesitated before stepping out. James watched her, waiting. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she turned and walked away. It wasn't until she was inside, leaning against the door, that she realized her hands were shaking. And worse, she wasn't sure if it was from fear or the undeniable pull of something she wasn't ready to name. Lena hadn't expected James to show up at the Sapphire Room again. Yet 3 nights after their dinner, there he was sitting in the same dimly lit corner, his presence impossible to ignore. She tried to focus on her job. Tried to act as if she didn't notice the way his eyes followed her across the room. But when she went to the bar to pick up a tray of drinks, her manager stopped her. You have a request, he said, nodding toward James's table. Lena's pulse kicked up. A request? He asked for you specifically? Her fingers clenched around the tray. Of course he did. James Calloway wasn't the type to take silence as an answer. She exhaled slowly, steeling herself before walking over. James looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. I don't remember agreeing to a second meeting, she said, keeping her voice even. You didn't, he admitted. I took a chance. Lena crossed her arms. Why? James leaned back, his gaze steady. Because you walked away the other night, but you didn't tell me to stay away. She hated that he was right, hated that a part of her wanted to sit down. I'm working, she said instead, his lips curved slightly. Then I'll wait. Lena should have ignored him, should have let him sit there until he got bored and left. But hours passed, and James remained in his seat, nursing a single drink, watching her like he had all the time in the world. By the time her shift ended, exhaustion weighed on her shoulders. Yet, as she stepped outside into the crisp night air, she wasn't surprised to find him waiting by the curb. Persistent, aren't you? She muttered. He shrugged. I know what I want, Lena sighed, rubbing her temples. James, come with me, he cut in. She frowned. Where? He extended a hand. Somewhere you can breathe, Lena hesitated. Logic told her to walk away. But the part of her that had been holding her breath for years, the part that craved something beyond routine and survival, reached for his hand. The moment their fingers touched, something inside her shifted. James led her to a waiting car, and soon they were moving through the city, the bright lights blurring past. Lena didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. When the car stopped, she stepped out and inhaled sharply. A private garden stretched before her, hidden behind towering hedges, bathed in soft golden light, a place untouched by the chaos of the city. She turned to James, her chest tightening. Why bring me here? He studied her, his expression softer now. Because I wanted to know what you'd look like when you weren't carrying the weight of the world. Lena swallowed hard. She didn't know how to respond to that, didn't know how to handle the way he saw her, like she was something rare. James took a step closer, his voice quieter now. You still think this doesn't mean anything? Lena's breath hitched. She wanted to say yes, wanted to hold onto the walls she had built. But standing there, surrounded by quiet beauty, with James watching her like she was the only thing that mattered, she couldn't. She exhaled shakily. I don't know what this is. James reached for her hand again, his grip firm, grounding. Then let's find out, Lena's heart pounded. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, She didn't have to figure everything out alone. James had never been a man who questioned his own choices. He built his empire with precision, calculated risks, and an unwavering determination. But Lena Carter had disrupted everything. She wasn't just another fleeting attraction. She was something deeper, something he couldn't shake. And as he stood in his penthouse staring out over the city, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't letting her go. Lena had left him in that private garden, her eyes filled with something she wasn't ready to name, but James had seen it, felt it. The pull between them was undeniable. He could wait. He had never been patient before, but for her, he would be. So when she stepped into the sapphire room the next evening, her posture tense but her gaze searching, he knew she had come back for a reason. She approached cautiously, her fingers trailing along the edge of a table as she stopped in front of him. He didn't speak first. He wanted her to say whatever she needed to say. She took a breath, steadying herself. When she finally met his eyes, there was no hesitation. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. James exhaled slowly, setting down his drink. He reached for her hand, brushing his thumb against her wrist. "Then let's figure it out together." Her lips parted slightly, and for the first time she didn't pull away. The world around them faded. The hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, all of it disappeared. It was just them. James had built his life around certainty, but with Lena, uncertainty had never felt so right. Days passed, then weeks. Lena found herself caught between two worlds, the one she had always known and the one James was pulling her into. She had never been inside a penthouse before. Never sat in a car that could probably pay her rent for a year, but James never made her feel like she didn't belong. He never pushed. Instead, he showed her pieces of himself she doubted anyone else had ever seen. The man behind the wealth, behind the power. The man who stayed up too late because his mind never stopped working. The man who, despite having everything, had been missing something vital. She wasn't sure how it had happened, but one evening she found herself curled up on his couch, her head resting against his chest as he traced slow circles on her back. "I didn't expect you," he murmured. She tilted her head slightly, looking up at him. "What do you mean?" James's fingers paused for a moment before continuing. "I didn't expect to find someone who made everything else feel insignificant." Lena swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She had spent so long guarding her heart, afraid to let anyone close. But James had slipped through the cracks, and now she wasn't sure if she could imagine her life without him. She didn't respond, not with words. Instead, she shifted, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that said everything she wasn't ready to voice. James pulled her closer, deepening it, as if he could hold onto this moment forever. Maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to figure everything out. Maybe, for once, they could just be, but the world had a way of creeping in. James's life wasn't just dinners in private restaurants and quiet moments on rooftops. It was ruthless business deals, press coverage, and expectations. Lena saw it firsthand when they attended a gala together. The moment they walked in, eyes turned toward them, whispers followed. "Who is she? She doesn't belong here." James didn't seem to care. His hand remained at the small of her back, his presence solid beside her, but Lena felt the weight of it all pressing down. A woman approached, draped in emerald silk, her smile sharp. "James, darling, you always did have a taste for surprises." Lena stiffened, but James's grip on her waist tightened. "This is Lena," he said, his voice even, "and she's with me." The woman's eyes flickered with something unreadable before she gave a polite smile and walked away. Lena exhaled slowly, forcing herself to breathe. James turned to her, concern flickering in his gaze. Ignore them, she wanted to, she really did. But this was his world, and she wasn't sure if she fit into it. James tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his eyes. "I don't care what they think, I care about you." Her heart clenched. Maybe she didn't belong in this world. Maybe she never would. But as James kissed her in the middle of that crowded ballroom, making it clear to everyone that she wasn't just some passing fling, she realized something. She belonged with him. And that was all that mattered. Lena had never felt so exposed. The moment James kissed her in that ballroom, claiming her in front of the city's elite, the weight of 100 scrutinizing eyes pressed against her like a force she couldn't ignore. But James didn't falter. His grip was steadfast, his presence grounding, as if nothing in the world mattered but her. She wanted to believe it. Wanted to let herself fall into the warmth of his certainty. But when the night ended, and she found herself alone in her tiny apartment, reality set in like a cold draft through the window. This was dangerous. She wasn't built for this world of whispered judgments and knowing stares. She had spent her whole life working to stay afloat, not mingling with people who had never worried about making rent or stretching a paycheck to the end of the month. And James. James was everything she had never allowed herself to want. But the problem with wanting was that once you started, it was impossible to stop. The next morning, Lena woke to the sound of her phone vibrating against the nightstand. She hesitated before answering, already knowing who it was. James's voice was low and composed, but there was an edge of restraint beneath it. He wanted to see her. She almost said no. Almost told him that whatever was happening between them needed to stop before it spiraled into something neither of them could control. But instead, she found herself in the back of a sleek car an hour later, being driven toward the unknown. When she arrived, she wasn't prepared for what she saw. A sunlit terrace stretched out before her, overlooking the city from a dizzying height. The table was set for 2 untouched cups of coffee waiting. James stood by the railing, his gaze distant, shoulders unusually tense. She stepped forward. He turned at the sound, his expression softening. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with something unspoken. Finally, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the sapphire room that night and kissed her by mistake. He was something else now, something more open, more vulnerable. And that scared her more than anything. She sat across from him, fingers curling around the warm ceramic of her coffee cup. James watched her carefully, as if waiting for her to decide something neither of them had put into words. She took a slow breath, choosing her next words carefully. She told him about her life before him, the struggle, the exhaustion of always being one step away from losing everything she had worked for. She admitted that she didn't know how to exist in his world, that she wasn't sure if she ever could. James listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he leaned forward, his fingers brushing against hers on the table. His answer wasn't immediate, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. He didn't care about the world's expectations. He didn't care about the divide between their lives. He only cared about her. Lena's throat tightened. She wasn't used to this, to someone choosing her without hesitation, without conditions. And maybe that was the problem. Because despite all her fears, all her doubts, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that sometimes mistakes led to the best things in life. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a mistake at all. Lena hadn't expected to wake up in James's penthouse. The night before had blurred into something almost dreamlike, a quiet dinner, a walk along the balcony, a moment where hesitation dissolved and she let herself fall. Now, wrapped in the warmth of his sheets, she turned onto her side, finding James already awake, watching her. There was something unreadable in his gaze, something deeper than the easy confidence he usually carried. A quiet intensity that made her pulse quicken. She had spent so much time trying to convince herself that this couldn't work, that they were too different. But here, in the golden morning light, that argument felt hollow. James brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering. Everything about him was deliberate. The way he moved, the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel like she was the only thing that mattered. Lena exhaled slowly, letting herself sink into the moment. But reality had a way of creeping in. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, shattering the quiet. She hesitated before reaching for it, but James was faster. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting. Her heart sank. She already knew what it was. Her landlord had been patient, but patience had limits. James didn't say anything as she read the message, but his eyes sharpened, assessing. Lena forced a small smile, setting the phone aside, but James wasn't the type to let things go. "You need help." It wasn't a question. She tensed. "I can handle it." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he sat up, resting his arm along the headboard, watching her like he was trying to figure out how to navigate this without pushing her away. "You don't have to do everything alone, Lena." She swallowed hard, looking away. This was the part she had dreaded, not the attraction, not the way he made her feel, but the weight of their differences. She had spent her whole life fighting to stay afloat. James had never needed to fight for survival, and yet here he was, offering something she wasn't sure how to accept. She shook her head slightly. "I don't want to be a problem you have to fix." James's hand found hers, his grip firm, grounding. "You're not a problem, and I don't want to fix you." Lena's throat tightened. She had heard promises before, but this wasn't a promise, it was a statement, and somehow that made it harder to resist. She exhaled, pressing her forehead against his shoulder. James didn't push for more. He simply held her, like he understood that some battles were fought in silence. But Lena knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't fighting this alone anymore. By the time they stepped out onto the street later that morning, the city was already alive with movement. James's driver was waiting, but Lena shook her head. "I need to go home," she said softly. James didn't argue, but as she turned to leave, his fingers caught her wrist. For a moment, they simply stood there, caught between two worlds. Then his lips brushed against her forehead, a quiet promise in the touch. Lena exhaled, stepping back. She wasn't sure where this was going. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. The next few days passed in a blur. Lena threw herself into work, trying to find balance in the chaos, but James was always there. A text, a call, an invitation to dinner that she turned down, only for him to show up at her doorstep with takeout instead. Bit by bit, he became woven into her life in ways she hadn't expected. And against all logic, she found herself letting him in. But the world had a way of reminding her that nothing was simple. She realized it the moment she stepped into the sapphire room and felt the shift in the air. Whispers, stares. She turned toward the bar, catching her coworker's wary glance. Then she saw it, a headline flashing across a patron's phone screen. "James Calloway's new mystery woman. Who is she?" Lena's stomach twisted. She had known this would happen. James wasn't just a man. He was a name, a presence, a life that didn't stay in the shadows. And now she was part of that spotlight. Her manager approached, looking uncomfortable. "You might want to lay low for a while," he murmured. Lena forced a tight smile. "I still have a job to do." But the truth was, she wasn't sure if she could do this. She wasn't sure if she was built for the world James lived in. And for the first time in weeks, doubt crept back in. James knew something was wrong the moment he saw her. She was quieter, guarded in a way she hadn't been before. He didn't press, not at first. But when they sat across from each other that night, the city stretching out behind them, he finally asked. She hesitated, fingers curling around the stem of her wine glass. Then she told him. About the stares, the whispers, the way her world had suddenly shifted because of him. James's expression darkened. "I should have prepared you for this." Lena shook her head. "It's not your fault." But James didn't look convinced. He reached for her hand, his grip steady. "I don't care what they say, Lena, and I won't let them take this from us." Her chest tightened. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that until now. James wasn't asking her to change. He wasn't expecting her to fit into a mold that wasn't hers. He just wanted her, and maybe that was enough. She exhaled slowly, threading her fingers through his. "I don't want to lose this," she admitted. James's lips curved slightly, his voice softer now. "Then don't." And just like that, the doubt faded. Because for all the differences between them, for all the ways this could go wrong, there was one undeniable truth. They belonged to each other, and nothing else mattered.